infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Hey everybody, this is Robert Harriman, and I appreciate you listening. The plague has a long, impactful, and devastating history on humankind, and is likely only rivaled by smallpox concerning historical significance. Some scholars have even suggested that the collapse of the Roman Empire may be linked to the spread of plague by Roman soldiers returning home from battle in the Persian Gulf in 165 AD. The bacterial agent of plague has been with us longer than previously suspected. Now, researchers from the University of Copenhagen sequenced Yersinia pestis DNA isolated from Bronze Age human teeth, which are between 2,800 and 5,000 years old. In a 2015 study, they said that those ancient bacterial genomes were basal to all known Yersinia pestis lineages, and estimated the origin of the Yersinia pestis lineage to be some 5,783 years ago, about 3,300 years earlier than previous estimates. Now, there's been 3 human plague pandemics on record. We have the plague of Justinian in the 6th century AD, the Black Death in Europe in the mid-1300s, and the third pandemic, which emerged in China in the mid-19th century. And these have all shaped human populations. Now, earlier outbreaks, like the plague of Athens some 2,500 years ago, and the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, may have also occurred. However, there's no real solid evidence to tie them to Yersinia pestis. The first recorded pandemic, the Justinian Plague, was named after the 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian I. The Justinian Plague began in 541 AD and was followed by frequent outbreaks over the next 200 years that eventually killed over 25 million people. The epidemic originated in Ethiopia in Africa and is spread to Pelusium in Egypt in 540. It then spread west to Alexandria and east to Gaza, Jerusalem, and Antioch. Then was carried on ships on the sea trading routes to both sides of the Mediterranean, arriving in Constantinople, now Istanbul, in the autumn of 541. The Byzantine court historian Procopius of Caesarea wrote that the epidemic was one, quote, by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated, close quote. He also described people with fever, delirium, and buboes, all characteristic of bubonic plague. The focus of the Justinian pandemic was Constantinople, reaching a peak in the spring of 542 with 5,000 deaths per day in the city, with some estimates putting it up to 10,000 per day. And it went on to kill over a third of the city's population. Victims were too numerous to be buried and were stacked high in the city's churches and city wall towers, their Christian doctrine preventing them from disposing them by cremation. Over the next 3 years, plague raged through Italy, southern France, the Rhine Valley, and Iberia. The disease spread as far north as Denmark, west to Ireland, then further to Africa, the Middle East, and Asia Minor. Between the years of 542 and 546, epidemics in Asia, Africa, and Europe killed nearly 100 million people. The pandemic also had a drastic effect and permanently changed the social fabric of the Western world. It contributed to the demise of Justinian's reign. Food production was severely disrupted, and an 8-year famine followed. The agrarian system of the empire was restructured to eventually become the three-field feudal system. Further major outbreaks occurred throughout Europe and the Middle East over the next 200 years. In Constantinople, in Iraq, Egypt, and Syria, and Mesopotamia, the plague continued in intermittent cycles in Europe into the mid-8th century and did not reemerge as a major epidemic until the 14th century. The next pandemic, the Black Death. The Black Death of 1347 originated in Asia and then spread to Crimea, then Europe, and then Russia. In a 1348 book entitled Decameron, the author describes the symptoms of bubonic plague as follows. Quote, "The symptoms were not the same as in the East, where a gush of blood from the nose was the plain sign of inevitable death. But it began both in men and women with certain swellings in the groin or under the armpit. They grew to the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and were vulgarly called tumors. In a short space of time, these tumors spread from the 2 parts named above to all over the body. Soon after this, the symptoms changed, and black or purple spots appeared on the arms or thighs, or any other part of the body. Sometimes a few large ones, sometimes many small ones. These spots were a certain sign of death, just as the original tumor had been and still remained." The term Black Death was not used until much later in history, and in 1347 it was simply known as the pestilence. And there are various explanations of the origin of the term. One author says the term refers to the hemorrhagic purpura and the ischemic gangrene of the limbs that sometimes ensued from the septicemia. Now another author states it derives from the translation of the Latin pestis atra, or atra mors, atra meaning terrible or dreadful, the connotation of which was black, and mors meaning death. So atra mors was translated as meaning Black Death. The overall mortality rate varied from city to city, but in places such as Florence, up to half the population died. The Italians called the epidemic the Mortalega Grande, or the Great Mortality. People died with such rapidity that proper burial or cremation could not occur. Corpses were thrown into large pits, and putrefying bodies lay in their homes and on the streets. People were as much afraid they would suffer a spiritual death as they were a physical death, since there were no clergy to perform burial rites. Shrift, or confession, there was none. Churches and chapels were open, but neither priests nor penitents entered. All went to the charnel house, a building or a vault where corpses or bones are piled. The sexton and the physician were cast into the same deep and wide grave. The testator and his heirs and the executors were hurled from the same cart into the same hole together. Transmission of the disease was thought to be by miasmas, disease-causing vapors emanating from corpses and decaying matter, or from the breath of an infected or sick person. Others thought the Black Death was punishment from God for their sins and immoral behavior, or was due to astrological or natural phenomena such as earthquakes or comets. People throughout Europe turned to this saint or another during the Black Death. The only remedies were inhalation of aromatic vapors from flowers and herbs, such as rose, aloe, thyme, and camphor. Soon there was a shortage of doctors, which led to a proliferation of quacks, selling useless cures, and amulets and other adornments that claimed to offer magical protection. To stop the pandemic was born the plague doctor. These were doctors specializing in the care for those infected by this disease. They were hired by the villages, and they took care of the citizens of all social classes, rich and poor. To treat the sick, they did bloodletting. Leeches and toads were used every day. But of course, this was not effective. In the 15th and 16th centuries, doctors wore a peculiar costume to protect themselves from the plague when they attended infected patients. They wore protective garb head to foot, made of leather or oilcloth, leggings and gloves and hoods, a wide-brim hat which denoted their medical profession, and a beak-like mask with glass eyes and 2 breathing nostrils, which were filled with the aromatic herbs and flowers to ward off the miasmas. They avoided contact with patients by taking their pulse with a stick, or issue prescriptions for aromatic herb inhalations, passing them through the door, and bobos were lanced with knives several feet long. In the period 1347 to 1350, the Black Death killed a quarter of the population of Europe, over 25 million, and another 25 million in Asia and Africa. Mortality was even higher in cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris, where more than half succumbed to the plague. Like the first pandemic, plague again caused great social and economic upheaval. Often whole families were wiped out and villages abandoned. Crops could not be harvested. Traveling and trade became curtailed, and food and manufactured goods became short. The second major epidemic occurred in 1361, the Pestis Secunda, in which 10 to 20% of Europe's population died. Other virulent infectious disease epidemics with high mortalities occurred during the same time, such as smallpox and dysentery. So by 1430, Europe's population was lower than it had been in 1290. It would not even recover to pre-pandemic level until the 16th century. Plague continued to occur in small epidemics throughout the world, but there was a major outbreak of Pneumonic Plague that occurred in Europe and England in 1665 to 1666. Between these years, a fifth of London's population died, some 100,000 people. The Great Fire of London in 1666 and the subsequent rebuilding of timber and thatch houses with brick and tile disturbed the rats' normal habitat, and it led to a reduction in their numbers, and may have been a contributing factor to the end of the epidemic. Outbreaks occurred on and off in Europe until the late 18th century, but none of them had the virulence or the mortality of the 14th century European Black Death. Now, the third pandemic, that of 1894, originated in Yunnan, China, and is spread to Hong Kong and India, and then to the rest of the world. The plague reemerged from its wild rodent reservoir in the remote Chinese province of Yunnan in 1855. From there, the disease advanced along the tin and opium routes and reached the provincial capital of Kunming in 1866, the Gulf of Tonkin in 1867, and the Kwangtung province port of Pak Hoi in 1882. In 1894, it had reached Canton and then spread to Hong Kong. It had spread to Bombay in 1896, and by 1900 had reached ports on every continent, carried by infected rats traveling the international trade routes on the new steamships. It was in Hong Kong in 1894 that Alexandre Yersin discovered the bacillus now known as Yersinia pestis, and in Karachi in 1898 that Paul Louis Simon discovered the brown rat was the primary host and the rat flea the vector of the disease. The third pandemic waxed and waned throughout the world for the next 5 decades and did not totally end until 1959. In that time, plague had caused over 15 million deaths, the majority of which were in India. Now, outbreaks of plague have been reported throughout the 20th century, primarily in China, Africa, and India. In Madagascar in the mid-1990s, a multi-drug resistant strain of the bacillus was identified. Much has changed to prevent the reoccurrence of pandemic plague, such as the development of the germ theory and the science of bacteriology, public health measures such as quarantine, and antibiotics such as streptomycin. But plague today is still an important and potential serious health threat of people and animals. In the first decade of the 21st century, 21,725 persons were affected by plague, with 1,612 deaths. The Congo reported more cases than any other country, including 2 large outbreaks of pneumonic plague, surpassing Madagascar, which had the most cases in the previous decade. 2 United States scientists suffered fatal accidental exposures. One, a wildlife biologist, who carried out an autopsy on a mountain lion in Arizona in 2007, died of the plague. And a geneticist with subclinical hemochromatosis in Chicago, who died after handling an avirulent strain of Yersinia pestis in 2009. There was an outbreak of Pharyngeal Plague traced to meat from a camel in Jordan in the late 20th century. An outbreak of gastroenteritis traced to meat of a sick camel in Afghanistan 10 years ago. Between January 1st, 2010 and December 31st, 2015, 3,248 cases of plague in humans were reported, resulting in 584 deaths. In Africa, 4 countries still report plague cases on a regular basis. Madagascar is the most seriously affected country in the world. It was thought that plague originated in Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, China, and this region is still the biggest natural focus of the disease. However, the at-risk population is restricted to breeders and hunters because of the reservoirs consist mainly of gerbils in the grasslands and marmots in the mountainous areas. In the Americas, Peru reports plague on a regular basis in 4 regions in the northwest of the country, where new foci emerged in 2013. In the western United States of America, plague circulates among wild rodents in rural and semi-rural areas, resulting in several cases every year. Humans are regularly infected through contact with domestic animals like cats and dogs. Now, the current plague outbreak in Madagascar, which has seen a rapid rise in cases in a short time, as of this recording, more than 800 cases since August, has caused a lot of concern for several reasons. Now, while plague is an endemic disease in Madagascar, cases, predominantly bubonic plague, are reported nearly every year during the epidemic season of September to April. However, this outbreak is predominantly pneumonic plague. About 70% of the cases in this outbreak are pneumonic. And the outbreak has been reported in non-endemic areas and in densely populated cities for the first time.